There used to be a dungeon in RuneScape bigger than Falador, Varrock, and everything between them combined. It was loaded with top-tier Slayer monsters and was just tiles away from both a Slayer Master and a bank. Players would spend months, sometimes even years, living inside this cave, and believe it or not, Jagex built it that way intentionally, so why would they later delete it? This is the story of RuneScape's Lost Mega Dungeon. Our story begins about 9 months after the launch of old-school RuneScape. By this point, the initial hype behind the game's release had worn off, leaving behind a smaller but passionate community. For the first 6 months, Jagex's development tools were extremely limited, and with little new content to play, many players had already moved on to other games. But that was starting to change. The team had just released the game's first new minigame, Nightmare Zone, followed shortly after by the re-release of the God Wars dungeon. These updates helped bring some players back, though the player base remained very small compared to today. Still, with improved tools and growing confidence, Jagex was finally ready to start building bigger things. Now, at the time, the team only had 2 content developers, Mod Ash and Mod Reach, so they had to prioritize the most important and most requested features first. One of the first parts of the game that needed serious attention was the Slayer skill. It was, and still is, easily one of old-school RuneScape's most beloved skills. But back then, it was incredibly bare bones. The core gameplay loop was there: talk to a Slayer Master, get assigned a monster to kill, finish the task, and repeat, but that was about it. All the modern conveniences just didn't exist yet. No Slayer points, no way to skip or block tasks, no boss tasks, no Slayer bosses, and no Slayer helmet. Most of these were hugely popular features from the original version of RuneScape, ones that old-school players really missed. To fix that, the development team set their sights on reintroducing one of RuneScape's most rewarding quests, Smoking Kills. This quest introduced the Slayer point system, the ability to block and skip tasks, a new Slayer Master, a new high-tier Slayer dungeon, and the iconic Slayer helm. But they quickly realized something. Most players didn't actually care about the quest itself. They just wanted the rewards. To be fair, that's true for most of RuneScape's quest. There's a reason that the game's most popular plugin turns every quest into click blue square. The old school team had never created a quest before too, so they decided they would just skip over it entirely and only add in the rewards. But of course, everything they wanted to add to the game would still need to pass a poll. So in November 2013, Mod Reach made a post on the RuneScape forums outlining everything the team hoped to add to the game, and there was a lot. Among the highlights were the Slayer point system, the Slayer helmet, new Slayer monsters, boss versions of those monsters, a new Slayer Master, and most importantly for this story, a brand new Slayer dungeon. This dungeon would be accessible only to players on a Slayer task. For example, if your task was to kill Hellhounds, you could fight them here. But if you weren't assigned that task, the game would stop you from attacking them. Following this blog, the team put everything up for a poll a few days later, and all of the major highlights passed with flying colors. It was a ton of content to add, especially for a team of just 2 developers. So they would release the updates in batches rather than all at once. They had no idea that one of these batches would add a dungeon so powerful, players would spend years arguing whether it should have existed at all. I've spent nearly a decade researching RuneScape's history. Meanwhile, I had no idea that at the same time, tons of companies were quietly researching me. Data brokers were collecting and selling personal information like my name, address, phone number, even relatives' names, all without asking. And chances are it's happening to you too. You might be surprised what's out there when you Google your name. Information that puts you at risk for things like identity theft, doxing, and stalking. That's where today's sponsor, Delete Me, comes in. They automatically find and remove your personal information from data broker sites. I've been using Delete Me since last year, and they've already taken down more than 150 listings about me, which helps me sleep a bit better at night. Get 20% off Delete Me consumer plans when you go to joindeleteme.com/Colonello and use promo code Colonello at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/Colonello, promo code Colonello. The first batch of updates arrived only a month after the poll passed, introducing the Slayer point system, the Slayer reward shop, and a now iconic Slayer master named Neve. Neve was based on a real RuneScape player, also named Neve. who is one of Mod Reach's friends. She was placed out in the middle of the gnome stronghold not for lore reasons, but simply because the real Neve is quite short. Visually, she also looked a bit different than she does today. Instead of a Fury amulet, she had an onyx necklace, and she had yet to get her iconic Elysian spirit shield, as the corporeal beast, which drops the Elysian sigil, wouldn't release until close to a year later. The second batch would arrive a few weeks after the first and introduced the Slayer helm to Old School, along with a few other smaller tweaks. Then, what we've been waiting for, Batch 3 on January 23rd, 2014 would bring the release of the Stronghold Slayer Cave. Its entrance would be placed directly behind Neve, and it was absolutely massive, larger than I think anyone was imagining. Just take a look at the map here to see just how many creatures they jam-packed into this area. But if you think it looks massive now, that's honestly nothing. You'll be shocked at how much larger this cave becomes. Everything in this cave could be killed with a cannon, an item that dramatically speeds up Slayer tasks wherever it can be used. Until then, monsters like Necreals and Abyssal Demons had never existed in a location where a cannon was allowed. Abyssal Demons also drop what was one of the most in-demand items of the time, the Abyssal Whip. You could now farm this valuable item faster than ever before, and its price would begin to slowly fall as a result. This little cave had accidentally turned the Gnome Stronghold into RuneScape's leading whip exporter overnight. Now, when this cave was first released, Neve could assign a total of 24 different monsters, excluding extra ones that you could unlock with Slayer points. Of those 24, 9 could be found within the cave itself. If you blocked 4 monsters that couldn't be found inside, that meant you had a nearly 60% chance of being assigned a monster located in this cave when slaying for Neve. And of course, if you had the points, you could simply skip any tasks that took you outside of it. Even in its early state, it was pretty obvious just how overpowered this cave already was. You could teleport to the Gnome Stronghold, grab a task from Neve, run only a few tiles east to gear up at the bank, and be inside the cave killing monsters within minutes. The area offered virtually everything you needed, and yet, even with all that, the cave wasn't finished. Take a look at the top right portion of the map. It's a big area, nearly as large as the entire west half of the cave, that's simply labeled "Coming Soon," which in RuneScape terms could mean next week or next decade, but luckily it was next week. It would become the home of Cave Krakens, Old School RuneScape's first ever brand new Slayer monster. Their best drop, the Trident of the Seas, quickly became one of the most sought after magic weapons in the game. A few months later, in April of 2014, Jagex added another new monster to the cave, Smoke Devils, which drop a best in slot magic necklace that remains highly sought after today. A boss variant was also introduced the same day, the Thermonuclear Smoke Devil. The expansion built to house these new monsters was, as you can see, much like the rest of the cave, absolutely massive. But that wasn't the only addition to the cave that day. Cave Krakens also received a boss variant of their own, simply called Kraken. With its release came a new drop, the Kraken Tentacle. Both the boss and regular Cave Krakens drop it, and when combined with an Abyssal Whip, it forms the Abyssal Tentacle, a powerful upgrade that quickly became one of the most sought after melee weapons in the game. Compared to the sprawling Smoke Devil expansion, Kraken's lair was relatively modest, but it still showed how this cave was quickly becoming the center of the Slayer experience. A few months later, Jagex proposed another round of major buffs for the cave. First, they wanted to add gargoyles to it, another high-level Slayer monster. The poll passed and gargoyles were soon added, but for the first time ever, Jagex also decided to ask whether gargoyles should be cannonable inside the cave. At the time, gargoyles couldn't be cannoned anywhere in the game, and not everyone had been happy when Abyssal Demons and Necreals gained that ability when the cave first launched. So this time, Jagex left the decision to the players, and the question actually failed. Players likely voted no because they didn't want to see the price of the Granite Maul, Gargoyle's best drop at the time, crash in value, the same way the Abyssal Whip did when Abyssal Demons became cannonable. After that, all future additions to the cave were made uncannonable. In June 2015, Jagex pulled adding Black Demons and Blue Dragons to the cave, but not whether they should be cannonable. And when those monsters were eventually added a few months later, players discovered they simply couldn't use a cannon on them. But why? Well, Jagex had started to realize just how overpowered the Stronghold Slayer Cave had become. Despite all the expansions and new monsters being added to Neve's pool, with the right block list, nearly 60% of her tasks still sent players right back into the same cave. And as I've mentioned a few times, many of them could only be cannoned there. Black demons and blue dragons could be cannoned in other areas of the game. So why didn't Jagex just allow players to do it inside of the cave as well? Perhaps it was an attempt to get players to slay in other locations. When the cave was first designed, Jagex wasn't thinking about long-term balance or sustainability. The old school team genuinely believed that the game would only last about 6 months after launch, after which it would close forever. Old school RuneScape was never meant to grow into what it eventually became. The cave was designed after that 6-month mark had passed, when player counts were near all-time lows. The team knew for a fact that the cave would be overpowered, but it's not like it really mattered when the game would be gone soon. They also figured that they might as well create content that brought the small remaining player base together, rather than scattering them across the world. But now, roughly 2 years after the cave's introduction, they had a unique problem. The game was still around, and more popular than ever. By now, Old School was neck and neck in player count with RuneScape 3. Not a bad problem to have overall, but a bad problem for the team's past design choices. Now, not only was the cave overpowered, it was quickly becoming overcrowded with players. Finding an open spot could mean hopping worlds dozens of times. And even then, you might get your spot stolen by someone else, especially if you weren't using a cannon. Impatient players would just pop a cannon down and steal the spot from someone else. The dungeon started to develop a pretty bad reputation for housing some of the game's most selfish and toxic players. Having to compete for a spot did lead some players back to older, previously abandoned Slayer areas, but the Stronghold Cave was still always packed. It was just too good not to use. The only way Jagex was going to successfully uncrowd the dungeon was to give players somewhere else to go that they would actually want to go to. By mid-2016, Jagex's development tools, skills, and team size had grown dramatically, and old school RuneScape was now consistently outperforming RuneScape 3 in terms of player size. Around this time, the team launched their most ambitious project yet, an entirely new continent called Zaya. One of the main reasons for Zaya's creation was to preserve the nostalgia of the original continent. Instead of cramming the main continent full of new content that old players wouldn't recognize, Jagex now had a completely fresh space where they could let their creativity flow. And of course, a continent that large wouldn't be complete without a dungeon. That's where the Catacombs of Kourend came in. The Catacombs were a brand new, massive Slayer dungeon filled with both low and high level monsters, which you could fight regardless of if you had a Slayer task for them or not. Getting your spot stolen would also be much less of a concern, because cannons couldn't be used here. It's also the only place players could obtain dark totem pieces, which could be assembled to challenge the Catacombs boss, Skatizo. And with a charged bone crusher, every time you killed a monster that dropped bones, they'd be crushed automatically and you'd regain a prayer point. There wasn't a Slayer Master nearby, but a bank wasn't too far away. It wasn't as overpowered as the Stronghold Cave, despite having more spawns, but it was still powerful with satisfying unique mechanics. Despite all of that, it was still no match for the sheer convenience of the Stronghold Slayer Cave. But by 2017, sentiment slowly began to shift. The Stronghold Cave's overcrowding issue had gotten out of control. As old school RuneScape continued to explode in popularity, the cave drew a record number of players every single day. Even with the Catacombs drawing away some of the traffic, finding a free spot was harder than ever before. Some players suggested balancing changes, like removing the ability to use cannons inside entirely, or just doubling the number of monster spawns to ease crowding. But most of these ideas never gained much traction. The only suggestion that really caught the player base's eye was the idea of splitting the cave into multiple Slayer dungeons scattered around the world. Old abandoned caves could be expanded, and entirely new ones could be added, each still requiring players to have a Slayer task for the monsters inside. Some would allow cannons, while others wouldn't. The goal was to bring back a sense of adventure to Slayer, encouraging players to explore the world world again, instead of defaulting to the easy overpowered option. A Reddit user named Gentle Tractor was inspired by the posts calling for the cave to be split up, and created a beautiful visual mock-up of what that might look like. This post resonated strongly with the community, and it quickly became one of the most popular posts in the subreddit's history. It got so big that multiple Jagex moderators would leave comments in support of it, but not everyone was convinced. Many players worried that such a large change, one that would inevitably reduce Slayer's ease and XP rates, would never pass a poll. Could the trade-off of making Slayer more engaging and less frustrating really outweigh the loss of efficiency? Well, in March of 2017, Jagex decided to find out. The team released a developer blog that essentially proposed the same idea Gentle Tractor and other community members had shared, splitting the Stronghold Cave into several new Slayer dungeons across the world, each themed around specific monsters. The proposal detailed plans to move creatures like black demons, abyssal demons, and Calphites into expanded or entirely new locations, from the Chasm of Fire on Zaya to a new Kraken Cove north of Eagle's Peak. It was an ambitious plan that promised more spawns, less competition, and a return to Slayer's adventurous roots. They called the update Diverse Dungeons. When Jagex put the idea to a poll in early April, the result shocked everyone. Nearly 90% of players voted yes to splitting up the cave. A few weeks later, the update went live, and just like that, the Stronghold Slayer Cave's reign as the one-stop shop for Slayer was over. The cave is actually still around today. It's just a fraction of its former size. It's a small reminder of how different Slayer, and old school RuneScape in general, used to be. Check out the video on the right about the Squeal of Fortune. It was RuneScape's first microtransaction, and the fallout from its introduction would reshape the game's future forever. Thanks to Delete Me for sponsoring the video. Use my link to get 20% off and start removing your data from the internet.